Hey everyone, we are about to write a story. This one's going to be a western of sorts, and right now all I have is the title, so we switched to story view. The story is going to be called Hanged Up High Where the Crows Can Pick at 'Em by Jay Wilburn. I was a little reluctant to take this one on because I tried to avoid stories that involve more gore on Twitch, but I think I can get by with this one and probably in a later off screen edit, I may decide to add more in terms of viscera and that sort of stuff. But we'll see. We'll see how that plays out here as we go along. So I have a few notes on the story that I'll be referring to as I go along, but nothing much more than just the title at this point. All right, sheriff, which I've already misspelled. I think we'll do one R on that. I don't know why spell check isn't picking that up. But we'll call him Sheriff Albert Pate deputized half the town to be sure these three ended their lives on the end of a rope. Let me change ended to finished. Alright. Sheriff Albert Pate deputized half the town to be sure these three finished their lives on the end of the rope. On the end of a rope. Alright. The tense is not exactly right because it'd probably be the ends of ropes, but I'm going to leave it the way it is there. The gallows had been slapped together in a hurry. Judge Kemp stood beside the sheriff. After the two of them had hurried, let's say rushed, I guess I've already said hurried, rushed the trial more than the building of the hanging place. Pate had convinced Kemp, Pate, let's maybe say the judge, had convinced the judge that it was too dangerous to move the Delta boys. Pate had convinced the judge that it was too dangerous to move the Delta boys to a bigger city for a proper hearing. Kemp didn't need much convincing. This was only 3 of them, but it was an important 3, and several hundred other members. Let me spell 100 right. And several hundred other members of the gang were scattered across the country. any delay, even one for something as noble as due process, might see these three busted out and most of the town killed in the process. Most of the town burned and killed. Killed in the process. The Delta boys had done far worse for far less. The gavel had no more than been settled, back on the bench before the fresh deputies dragged the defendants out of the courthouse and up the loose boards of the gallows steps. Alright, so we got all that established. Now let's get moving here. This is your part, Al. Judge Kemp elbowed the sheriff. Place the nooses, he said. Grumbles of agreement ran through the crowd as the wind picked up more dust from the dry streets. Deputies on platform fed the loops over the criminals' heads. And tightened up the knots. If bad men do these, we don't need two of these, do we? If the bad men had their hands loose, Al knew these fellows on the platform wouldn't be half as bold. Other men prepared. Hold on, let me do this. What about hoods? Someone from the crowd asked Al and Kemp exchanged a look. The judge spoke up. No time. If this is not a scene you care to see, you are dismissed. No one left, but Al knew they had messed up. Last words. The sheriff called up from the street. Mr. Smith, the fellow on Al's left as he faced the platform took a step forward. His boots thumped on the trapdoor. Al wondered if the bandit realized he was doing them a favor. Let me put his name in here. Santiago Smith. Santiago spoke bold and clear. You are villains. You are the villains in this story. Each of you has no love of justice, and your soft tyranny of the apathetic will be the end of you. Men like the sheriff. Hey, Clever, thanks for jumping in, man. Men like the sheriff and this so-called judge will pervert justice any time it serves them. I was just getting ready to sit down with the book. All right. Hopefully I'll write a story that's interesting for you for a little while here. All right. Santiago was... Am I spelling that right? I don't think I am. Santiago. Let me put an A in. Santiago was a strange bird. Hal wasn't sure the man was Spanish at all, but who was he to say? His whole life had been spent in 2 towns. The Delta boys were well traveled. Santiago had a sharp jawline. Could have been an actor with that voice and that face if he'd done something with his life other than murder or steal. Alright. He was looking pale in the bright sun today. Al supposed that was understandable, considering he was about to hang. Still, the guy was pasty white out here in the desert climates. Strange. Looked like a vampire in the sun. Sweat beaded Santiago's hairline as he continued his speech. There will be retribution. There will be a reckoning. Alright, what else? The Delta boys don't forget their enemies. And today, every single one of you has made the worst enemy you could possibly drop him. The judge yelled. It wasn't his place, but the first... No, it wasn't his place, but the order was followed. The first crude lever pulled. First crude lever pulled, and the first Delta boy dropped until the rope stopped him with a snap. He did not twitch at all. He took 3 wide swings and then settled into a slow twist from side to side. Move Mr. River Spitz on up. Sheriff. That's right. Sheriff Al Pate said. River was a bigger man, but didn't put up a fight as his boots thumped on his trapdoor. Last words Al called. He feared his own reluctance sounded clear in his voice. River stuttered over a few syllables, but then spoke up, barely above the dying wind. It was the sort of humility that would have served him well in life. I'm real sorry, River. Let me put a period there. River finally formed a sentence. I'm sorry to my mama. I'm sorry to my father, brothers, sisters, and their kids. Wish they was still alive, but kind of glad wish they were still alive, but kind of glad they didn't live to see me like this. I guess I'm just trying to say that, well, I don't know that I would have done anything different given the chance to live my life over. If I was that kind, I probably would have made better choices the first time through. Maybe wouldn't have killed so many people just out of spite. But who knows? I don't. I'm just, I don't know. After the wind punctuated the silence for a few beats. Al asked, "Is that it?" River shrugged, causing his noose to ride up his thick neck about, I don't need to say about, up his thick neck an inch or two. I guess I better be sorry to God too while I have the chance. But I guess that's it, sir. Al nodded and called, "Pull it." The trap door burst open. River's weight took care of his neck. There were 3 distinct cracking noises. The second body twisted around 3 times as Al drew in breath to see about the last man and the worst one by any measure. River's rope snapped and he hit the ground with authority. The crowd gasped. Al could tell by the position of the landing and the unnatural turn of the head that the man's neck was broken and he had gone to face God as sorry as he was able. Still, he took the time to send a deputy to confirm it before moving on. Alright. Delroy Joy stepped up onto the 3rd trapdoor like it was his own idea to do so. Al almost couldn't find the words or the will to say them. only one left, and he was the head of the dragon. Let's say Al again. Al kind of wanted to take the time to track down the Hoods, but that would leave this evil soul on Earth a bit too long for the sheriff's liking. Last words Al managed to say again. Delroy Joy made a show of leaning over the open trap door next to him, where River Spitz had died, and then snapped his rope as a final what's the word I'm looking for? As a final insult. As a final insult. He looked back up and winked at the crowd. I guess that fat little man had one more surprise for all of us. Maybe I'll have one for you too. Delroy cut his eyes to the hazy west, like he was expecting something or someone to come. The crowd checked that direction too, as uneasy murmurs traveled about. That it? Hal called. Delroy made a big, loud sigh. The crowd went silent and turned their full attention up instead of west. Well, Al, let me do this. Well, Al, Delroy began. I'm not sorry, like River, so I won't be babbling about forgiveness or my mama today, and I don't think much about justice, so I won't be calling down retribution like Santiago was trying to do. So I guess sure. Al. That's about it. Good luck. Al hesitated. He almost let the question slip as to what Delroy Joy might be wishing him luck for. Al felt he needed it, but wasn't sure he wanted it coming from this dark soul. Pull it. The sheriff whispered. The door fell downward on its rough hinge. Delroy dropped and never blinked. He bounced on the end of his rope and swung as his legs kicked and his body jerked. Let me spell that right. As his body jerked from side to side. Figures he wouldn't have. Okay, I'll say figured. Keep it all past tense. Figured he wouldn't have the decency to just break his neck and die outright. Crowd murmured again as Delroy finally went still with his eyes bulging and his face a raw shade of purple. Take them down and let's get them buried away so that Delroy kicked again. He managed to blink and arched his back Judge Kemp cursed, and he wasn't the only one. Al found himself wishing he'd just accepted Mr. Joy's offer of good luck. They waited him out again. This time, his face was almost black. Al sent a deputy to poke Delroy with a stick. As the deputy shoved deep into the bandit's ribs. Still pretty suddenly, Bobbin. Hold on. Still pretty saddened by Ben Bova's death in 2020. He was a sci-fi favorite of mine. I picked up some of his stuff at the local bookstore. Those will be keeping me preoccupied for a month or two. Yeah, it was. I was reading him forever ago. You know, it's one of those guys that you feel like has just been alive forever. You know, seems like you just lose more and more, and it's starting to be authors I've actually known along the way. Alright, as the deputy shoved deep into the bandit's ribs, I was shocked, genuinely shocked when I heard the news. Yeah. I'm actually kind of thankful we haven't heard more losses like that. We'd been losing so many great authors even before we got into the pandemic. I started wondering if that was going to accelerate. So I'm kind of thankful that we're not seeing. Yeah, I'm kind of thankful that we're not seeing more authors. Well, just more greats of all sorts of creative endeavors falling away with all this going on. Hopefully it'll be gone soon. But again, this is the reality of us living long enough, I guess. As the deputy shoved deep into the bandit's ribs, Al found himself thinking about Jesus on the cross. That my New Year's late, but hey, it is to read more monthly fiction magazines too. There's some decent ones out there. Not as many as there. Yeah, I got your resolution. There's not as many as there used to be, but there's some pretty good ones out there. I know Dark Moon Digest is one of my favorites. That one's quarterly, and there's several others, especially if you expand out of genre. I've kind of lost track of the old magazines over the years. It used to be a thing that I never got them new, but I used to have a couple bookstores that would have them when I was younger, like late 80s and maybe into the 90s, but not too much, I don't think. I'd moved on to just books by then, but just found them laying around and never really kept them, never really had any loyalty to any one magazine at that point. I was reading mostly sci-fi, I think, and I would just look in, and whatever pictures or story title or whatever caught my attention, I would get it, and really wouldn't pay much any attention to what magazine it was or anything like that. So I was probably a pretty bad example of a reader back then, and for all I know, some of those magazines were valuable later on, but I never kept track of them, and a lot of them got thrown out with old tapes and everything else as my room got cleaned up over the years. My granddad had fantasy and sci-fi for many years, and I would read those for years, even was subscribed to them for a few years. I still consider myself a bad reader. Do you still have copies of all that stuff? because I never kept it. Like again, I had cassette tapes of bands, and eventually those got thrown out. And same thing with the magazines. Whatever I didn't take with me to college at one point just kind of got cleaned out of my room. So there's a lot of stuff that I had to send back. I had copies of King's Gunslinger. When I started rereading all of King's books in order, um, there were books that I used to own that I ended up rebuying. So um, I probably should be spending more money on independent authors who could really use the money. But I've bought copies of Stephen King's books more than once for some of them. So I think I'm keeping him secure in his finances there if he ever hits a dry spell. Oh, when he serialized it, yeah. I had I had the again, this is something else that disappeared over the years. I had the serialized copies of the Green Mile when it was coming out one by one. It was no collector's edition, obviously, um, but I was buying those from the bookstore uh, when they were first coming out, the little bitty chapters. But again, when I reread it, I had to go buy another copy of it with it all together because I'd lost those over the years. Yeah, it's not uncommon for me to double dip if I enjoy it well enough. I've even gotten paperback and then go back for hardcover. Um, yeah, I haven't been much of a book collector. I started buying up, and again, this is another author that there was a time when I owned the books and then they kind of disappeared over the years. But I was buying up Brian Keene's books because after I finish all of King's books, which I'm hoping will be at the end of this year, but my rate of reading is not being very promising for that. I was hoping to get back then to move on to another author and read all of Brian Keene's books in order. So he produces a lot of books, but they're shorter. So I'm hoping that'll go a little faster. But again, I gotta get moving on that reading. I got really serious about it in 2020. Like the pandemic kind of freaked me out. So I was like, I'm gonna finish these up. I'm not gonna waste a lot of time on this. So I moved really fast through those. But I'd set an unrealistic word count per day in order to finish, and so those books, um, I fell behind, but still reading, but at a slower pace. So I'll be lucky if I finish the rest of King's books. I'm in the Wolves of Kala in the Dark Tower series, so the next two Dark Tower books come after that in order, and then I have maybe a little less than a third of his catalog to go. A couple big books in there, but my plan is to be all caught up eventually there. Alright, as the deputy shoved deep into the bandit's ribs, Al found himself thinking about Jesus on the cross. That would have made the rest of them the Romans. For some reason, the deputy poked a second time, and Delaroy moved again. This time he... No, it's fine, man. You can talk anytime you want. This time he didn't thrash the dying bandit, just smiled, and his blood shot eyes tracked the crowd. The deputy dropped the stick and bumped one of the posts as he staggered away. A wet say wispy sound escaped. Let me spell that right. A wet wispy sound escaped Delroy's throat through the puckered flesh around the noose. Man's lips moved. Alright, the man's lips moved as if he had something new to say, but no sound other than the smack of his swollen lips. His tongue hung out, and Delroy bit it twice as he continued his silent speech. The blood dripped dark onto the sand under his swinging boots. Al, Judge Kemp whispered. The sheriff drew his gun and thumbed back the hammer. Delroy paused in whatever he was saying, but he didn't seem afraid with his clownish grin and his bleeding tongue stuck out. Alright. Al took careful aim. The crowd moved aside, east and west. He pulled the trigger, and everyone startled, even though they knew what was coming. A hole as black as midnight opened in the center of his shirt. Just a hair to the left of one of the buttons. Delroy shook with the impact. Al couldn't tell if it exited his back. a small dribble of blood ran down the front. No more impressive than a drop of wine. Delroy blinked twice, and a wheezy exchange of breath followed. It took Al a few seconds to realize that Delroy Joy now hanged for nearly 10 minutes and shot in the chest to boot, was laughing at him. He managed 2 wheezy words for the sheriff. Try again. Al raised his weapon and emptied it into the body. More wine spilled from more holes. Delroy drooped, and the entire town exhaled all at once, like air escaping a mine shaft. The relief was short-lived as Delroy raised his head to wheeze and laugh again. More guns and rifles raised all around. Most of them were not officially deputized. Neither Al nor Kemp said, I'll say Judge Kemp. Neither Al nor Judge Kemp said a thing to call them off. Delroy was the one who gave them permission. Good luck, he wheezed. Pull it. The town unloaded on him. Alright, now let's jump into the weird here. They tried twice more to hang him, riddled with bullets. Delroy Joy. Delroy Joy barely spoke and barely bled. His neck refused to snap. On the ground, the crowd took turns bludgeoning him with every hammer and club-like object they could find. His bones refused to snap, and as his body darkened all over with bruises, he still refused to die. As they brought him to his feet again, he slumped in the grasps of reluctant deputies. The darkest bruises were ringed around his neck from 3 hangings. As he smiled, a few yellowed teeth showed through bullet holes in his cheeks. Delroy Joy's voice sounded like gravel, maybe from the ropes. So that was something. You guys are wasting a lot of time you don't have. One of the deputies whispered in Al's ear. He nodded, and they dragged Delroy into one of the shops. A few people watched through the windows a while, but then walked away green. Alright, what do I got here? Alright. Al and the judge watched from across the road Delroy screamed. Blood spattered the inside of the glass and then splashed up again. The screaming went on. How? Judge Kemp asked. Al just shook his head. As the screaming and the sounds of meaty impacts continued, two men walked out with bloody leather aprons. They were coated in the stuff. They whispered some instructions, and a few men in town went to see about whatever had been decided. The sheriff and judge were not consulted. All right. One of the bloody men lit up a cigarette. He took a few puffs and then handed it off to the other man. The first fellow blew the smoke from his lungs and nodded to Sheriff Pate. Al nodded back. The two men exchanged a haggard look and returned to the work inside. A few moments later, a half-dozen men showed up with axes. After they steeled their nerves a moment, they entered the shop. The sound of the blades hitting hard filled the street. A lot of people watched still, but from a greater distance. Delroy's, let me use his full name, Delroy Joy's screams of agony continued, but never stopped. Alright, scene break. They lifted his head from the trough of water for a third time. He had, okay, let me say who he is. Delroy had been under for almost an hour this time. He was paler than Santiago had been. Santiago had been before he died. Delroy was pale everywhere except for the gashes, and a word processor automatically puts in page break there when I use the asterisk like that. I know how to change it. Oh no, I don't do the page break. Delroy was pale except everywhere except where the gashes and rips in his skin, let's say flesh, his flesh showed through to his unbreakable bones. After a few more seconds, he coughed and spewed up discolored water all over his ruined clothes and the muddy ground around the trough. My arms are tired. One of the deputies complained. Can someone sub in for me? I'm not sure that's proper language from the West, but I'm going to leave it in for now. Can someone sub in for me? Another man shuffled forward, but Al held up a halting palm. Just put him on the ground for a moment. They propped Delroy against the trough with his hands tied and his boots out in two directions. The bandit heaved for breath as Al stood over him. Judge Kemp hissed through his teeth and wandered away a few feet. "What are you?" Al asked. Delroy choked on his laugh and then laughed some more. "Just tell me who you are. How is this possible? Some guys have all the luck." Delroy croaked. "Are you a vampire or some other kind of monster?" Al asked. "Have you been cursed? Are you even human?" Delroy turned his bloody eyes west, where the sun was dying along the horizon. "If I am, it's getting dark, and your luck is running out with the light, Al." Okay, hold on. "Why won't you die?" Al asked. "It's your job to kill me," Delroy said as he met the sheriff's eyes. Alright, as he met the sheriff's eyes. "It's your job to kill me," Delroy said as he met the sheriff's eyes. "It's not my job to die for you." "How long have you been like this?" Judge Kemp asked without turning around. "Like what?" Delroy asked, as if he were really curious. "Immortal," Al answered for the judge. "Hard to know such a thing." Delroy's eyes rolled. Showing more bright red where the whites of his eyes should have been. We're all kind of immortal up until we find ourselves dead. We're all kind of immortal up until we find ourselves dead. Just most people live like they're already dead and just waiting to make it official. Are you going to heal from all this if we let you? Al asked. We can't let that happen. The judge growled, but refused to face the accused. I guess we'll find out, won't we? You guys got to go to bed sometime. You've got to go back to life eventually. And trouble will come for you long before you figure any of this out. It's getting dark, Sheriff. One of the deputies said. We're going to need tools and fresh men, Al said. Bring them kicking and screaming if you have to, but bring them. They shoveled more dirt and piled more rocks as the sun rose in the east. Everyone's hands were blistered and bloodied through their gloves. I'll say even through their gloves. Even through their gloves. the grave had become a hill where there had once been a deep pit. Is this going to be enough? Judge Kemp asked as he dropped the pickaxe. Is that a compound word? It is. As he dropped the pickaxe and sat down hard. Al had a hand rested upon one of the bigger rocks. He thought he felt a vibration, and he hoped that was from one of the last shovels full of dirt. And not something else below. I don't know. Al said, we probably put guards on the place for a while. Judge Kemp looked around to be sure the other men were out of earshot. And what do we do if Delroy Joy does dig himself out? Al glanced at the mound of dirt and rocks, as if saying the man's name might summon him. The sheriff shook his head. We hope our luck changes. Alright, I'm not sure that's going to be the ending, but I think that's pretty close to the story I want to write. So again, the story, which is currently at 2,600 words, probably needs a little fleshing out, but that's true of every first draft I do. The story's called Hanged Up High Where the Crows Can Pick at 'Em, and it's about a bandit named Delroy Joy who apparently cannot die. And so they did their best to kind of chop him up or drown him or hang him twice or shoot him, and he just kept not dying. So they ended up burying him and are hoping that he stays under. But of course, how do you execute somebody who just doesn't have the decency to up and die?